Good afternoon. This is Dr. Craig Stern at Pharma Pharmaceutical Consultants and ProData Analytics. We're a few minutes late here today for our Facebook Live. Client issues have made sure that we're not always on time for everything. This will be the last Facebook Live for the year. We're traveling significantly on business for the next few weeks and then for the holidays, so we don't want to labor you with this, and we will return just after the beginning of the year. I'm delighted to have a chance to talk to you, and I want to take up an issue today that has to deal with information. There's a lot of information going on today about fake news, about people saying things that aren't true, and fact-checking, and all of this stuff going on for whether information is real or not real. It is one thing, and it's clearly true about politics, but it's also true about healthcare, and it has been going on for some time. So it's not like healthcare has not had people that have said things that are untrue or things that are not verified, etc. But I do want to talk about information because I think in a world where there's so much noise and so much information with regard to social networking and the news and TV and radio, etc., that we begin to understand that we're bombarded with information, some of which is valuable, some of which is not. And so we need to begin to ask ourselves, do we just believe everything because someone said it? Or do we question it? In the case of healthcare, it's terribly important because many of these things are going to be used for treating patients. And if it's not real, and if it's not true, then clearly we are giving a disservice as healthcare professionals to people by giving them therapy or otherwise that just isn't valuable information and won't help them. The other part of it is that it's easy to mix up marketing, promotionals, or otherwise with information that is valuable, whether it's on healthcare policy or whether it's on direct information with regard to therapeutics or otherwise, and try and mix the two of them up. For example, and only as an example, it's very common for all of us, both healthcare professionals and lay public, to see that something is new and therefore it's better than whatever we had before, and therefore we should be paying attention to it because that's going to be what we're going to use and effectively throw out the old and bring in the new. But in fact, that's not true. There's a significant number of new things that are coming out that are being substantiated based on what's known as non-inferiority studies that effectively says, I'm no worse than anything else, and so therefore you can trust me. The hope would be that these information and these studies demonstrate that there's some value with regard to safety, and potentially if it's no different than something else, then therefore it should be better. However, the argument has come about, and there's a lot of that today, with regard to the cost of many of these issues, where one product is the same with regard to whether it lowers blood pressure, whether it lowers cholesterol, whether it lowers diabetes, and some of the indicators for blood sugar and hemoglobin A1C. But the safety is either exaggerated or it's something that we take and we identify that this will be very useful in a certain set of patients, but perhaps not in others. It's very important, for example, that especially as professionals, we subset populations to deal with more severe populations and how they will respond and what their needs are versus less severe populations and how they will respond. It is a very important indicator. It's not frequently talked about. Some of the new therapy may be very useful for a certain subset of the population, but not terribly useful or even too expensive for a population subset that can't afford it. Many of the new recommendations with regard to whether they appeal the political issues, appeal the Affordable Care Act, or issues with regard to tax subsidies and the rest, tend to put a lever where those that can afford health care get a benefit. Those that can't afford it The poor are caught where they can't afford it even more under many of these different outlooks. So it's not a matter of just following a particular political perspective, but it's trying to understand how is that going to impact different populations? How are they going to be addressed? How are they going to be paid for, et cetera, whether it's a individual micro payment for an individual or whether it's the entire country and how they're going to pay for the cost. I want to take an example. I haven't looked at this, so I'm not trying to pick on anything or otherwise, but I'm using our site of the RxInfoX, which is the Rx Information Exchange. The link to it is on the link that you have with the Facebook Live, so you can see it. And I want to bring up some fundamental issues that anyone can use in looking at information so that we begin to create an area where we're looking at information and we don't necessarily just believe things because they exist, but rather we ask some honest questions. And you don't have to be a statistician and you don't have to be an expert in data. You don't have to be data analysts like us or otherwise in order to do it. You just have to take a look at something and say, yes, I believe it, or no, there's something here and I don't know whether it's useful. I'm now looking at, and it's right in front of me, so I'm just picking it up because I just want to make some comments about it. The Rx Information Exchange is where we, ProPharma and ProData, have taken a group of keywords, have gone out to the internet. We bring them in a host of different areas with regard to the pharmaceutical industry, healthcare, critical and decision analysis, pharmaceutical manufacturers, etc. So we have one place that you can go in order to try and get information. So having said that, when I look at it here, I see that the major indicators for healthcare stocks are all in the red. They're all down. Effectively, the SPDR, Standard & Poor's Pharmaceutical, the biotech stock index is down by about 1%. The iShares Standard & Poor Healthcare Sector is down 0.5%, and the NASDAQ Healthcare Index is down almost 2%. So one of the things that we're looking at is to see, well, how does that compare with the rest of the market and what's going on? Not because we expect healthcare to be the same. In fact, the normal inflation in general for the economy is about 3%. But healthcare increases somewhere in the range of 5% or more. So we're effectively looking at things and we're saying, wait a minute, these things are not the same, and effectively we're dealing with a discount that isn't that doesn't keep up with inflation. In fact, it's greater than inflation. So therefore, people are looking at that and saying, if I have $1, that dollar is going to lose its value faster with healthcare than it is with regard to overall healthcare inflation. Well, the fact that it's down and the Dow 30 is up about 0.1%, but the overall NASDAQ is down 0.74%, indicates the entire market is looking down. But it's also a view of what the healthcare industry is looking at and saying, in the long term, we're not seeing a great deal of benefit. Clearly, there may be some benefits with the new administration, and they evaluate that and deal with that on a daily basis. But right now, the overall view about what's going on in the market is negative. The next thing we look at is healthcare news. The intent of that is clearly what's interesting. So there's nothing here that's really data, and from a standpoint of data analysts, we're not saying something is wrong. We're just looking at it. Things with regard to Thomas Jefferson's diet, where he liked French food, which probably isn't anything special since he was a ambassador to France, and so as a result of that, he liked French food, which at the time was known to be significantly better than English food. And then some issues with regard to Burger King's menu is being hit with nutrition, etc., high protein diets and things like that. What they're telling us is these are kind of interesting. I don't know whether you want to make a decision about it or otherwise, but they're kind of interesting issues. The second part has to deal with pharmaceutical manufacturing news. And here, these are kind of issues where the manufacturers are identifying to us where they want to spend their money and where they think the future is going to be. So we look at that really from the standpoint of, so where are people putting their money? Where should we be watching? Not because it's something that we expect today, but rather something that we expect going forward, and how things are going to be, the money is going to be used in new products that we can expect to see. So in that regard, we're seeing that J&J is trying to buy a firm called Actelion, that Pfizer and Lilly are having price increases with regard to Viagra and Cialis, which is, of course, a commodity item that people are buying off the internet. And then issues with regard to Teva laying off people in Malta. That gives us an idea of where they're putting their money and where the manufacturing issues are. Pfizer is dropping an Ireland plant expansion of about $425 million due to a loss of construction jobs, and really a reflection of its failure of its cholesterol drug. So this is really where people are talking about their money and where that's going. The other part is specialty medication. These are the really expensive drugs where we're talking about drugs that on average cost $1,500 or more a unit. And when you look at this, we see that this is also for information purposes. Where is the specialty? There's an issue here on a statement from President-elect Donald Trump about his statement about appointing Representative Tom Rice as Secretary of Health and Human Services. So that's of interest. There's no real data about it. Infectious diseases mortality is down, but still poses a risk. We know that there's been a problem, self-imposed, because of overuse of antibiotics, but it's a self-imposed problem. But where mortality may be down, that doesn't mean that we have a issue where morbidity or disease itself is still a major problem. There's making diagnoses with individual patients. And when we see information on one patient or they talk about an individual, we find it of interest, but that's really more of a case study. We're not making decisions on it. We're only identifying that these may lead to further studies to see if, in fact, these kind of results match out. And remember that when we're talking about therapy, the main issues we're dealing with are effectiveness and risk. There may be some issues in the new Cures bill where there's going to be a significant amount of funding for the FDA and others to do drug research. On the other side, stakeholders on the other side are saying that that's a problem because there's going to be more openness with regard to manufacturers not having to deal with some of the restrictions that they've had to deal with. At the end of the day, our fundamental concern, whether it's an individual or whether it's a healthcare provider or otherwise, is are they helping us to make sure that our therapy is safe, or are they just opening it up so that we have more medication, more particular therapies that are complementary to medication, or even surgeries, etc., but they in fact don't add any particular value. Then there's some other just general issues about thunderstorm asthma and the rest, and I hesitate to make any emphasis on that because using data you can easily identify that there is in fact a association between one thing or another, but it may have no absolute reality in causation or what's really happening. It's just of interest. So associations are interesting. Maybe they're useful, maybe they're not useful, but if they're not proven, we can't really make decisions about what that means. In analytics, we're talking about prostate cancer screening tests. That's always been a problem. Because of the large value of false positives where people are diagnosed with particular prostate problems, especially prostate cancer problems, but in fact they don't have it. And so they're bringing it up. It's still of issue. There's talking about an issue with Momenta Pharmaceuticals and confirmatory studies in phase 3. Remember that sounds good, but until it's been approved, we don't know whether, in fact, these are just positive results trying to create some interest in the marketplace about it, or whether it means. You don't have to be an expert in any of this. All you have to identify is that a lot of this is either an association or it's interesting, but you're not making some general statement. And hopefully, especially in science and otherwise, there's always going to be people who are going to identify that, well, that may be interesting, but it's not real news. It's not true or otherwise. And that's why we want to take many of these things as, well, it's interesting, but maybe not. The pharmacy news is common, and we see a lot of things going on about the same thing. And I would bring up to you that some of this has to deal with repeating information from the same sources. The first thing you'd think about if you see that is, are they using too narrow of a group of search terms because they're seeing the same thing over and over? And this is a criticism. In looking at it, I'm the one who puts this out, but I'm identifying that maybe our search terms are too narrow, so we should expand that so we're not seeing the same information from just. It may be that that's the only thing that's being published based